Thank you for attending this MD2K webinar. Dr. Susan Murphy is the H.E. Robbins Distinguished University Professor of Statistics, Professor of Psychiatry, and Research Professor for the Institute of Social Research at the University of Michigan. She directs the Statistical Reinforcement Learning Lab there. In 2014, she was elected a member of the National Academies Institute of Medicine, and in 2013, she was selected as a MacArthur Fellow.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start with the first one. As you know, you've seen the title. The title's on your screen. So what we're going to do is I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So I'm going to go over what an adaptive intervention is and and how it's related to a just-in-time adaptive intervention. Of course, the whole goal, the title of this talk is about micro-randomized trials. But the reason why we're interested in micro-randomized trials is because we're interested in just-in-time adaptive interventions. So we need to cover that first. Okay, so we're going to start with adaptive interventions. These are the designs of interventions that take advantage of response heterogeneity to different types of treatments. And the way it does that is by individualizing the interventions or the treatments to the individual and how the individual's needs change over time. And I wanted to go through a very simple example. Some of you have heard, like Bonnie, for example, has heard this example before. I was a consultant on this project. This is an adaptive. It's going to help us get our terminology straight, even though it's not a mobile health application. And so this is the adaptive drug court program for offenders, drug-abusing offenders. And there's a series of papers about this program. So in this adaptive drug court program, the offenders come into the program and they're divided into low risk or high risk. High risk, these are offenders who have been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, or they've had formal drug abuse treatment. Otherwise, they're low risk. And there's two types of interventions you can provide here. Of course, you want to help people with their drug abuse problem, and you also have to deal with the criminality. So if you're high risk, you're provided a very expensive intervention that is bi-weekly court supervision, court hearings, and then standard drug abuse counseling. If you're low risk, you're provided standard counseling. So that's the upper box on the left-hand side. So there's a very big difference in cost in these two options, much more expensive intervention for high-risk individuals. And then as the drug court program progresses, each month, all offenders are assessed, and if they're doing well, they're following the rules of the program, they appear to be responding to the drug abuse counseling, then they just stay with whatever level of supervision that they're currently at. However, perhaps they're not doing well, in which case they're either non-compliant or non-responsive. And the dotted lines correspond to non-compliant. The solid arrows correspond to non-responsive. So what is non-compliant here? This is someone who's not following the rules of the drug court program. They're either missing too many substance abuse counseling, group counseling sessions, or they're not showing up for the drug urine screens, a sufficient number of drug urine screens. If they're non-compliant, their judicial supervision is increased, it's stepped up. Now, the non-responsive people, they're people who are compliant. So you would think they would be doing well, but the problem is that they're having too many positive urine screens. And so in this case, this is not someone who's not trying. They are trying, but they have a drug abuse problem, which is too severe for standard group-based counseling. So they're moved up to what's ICM. That's the squares, the figures on the right-hand side. ICM is intensive case management. This involves individual counseling and other types of support. So this is an adaptive intervention. You can tell it's adaptive because it's adapted to the risk level of the individual, and then it's also adapted to how the individual is progressing as they move through the program. The goal of this program, of course, is to have people successfully graduate from the drug court program. So an adaptive intervention has 5 elements, and we're going to see we saw all of these elements in the last slide with the drug court program. There's both a distal outcome in the case of the drug court program. That would be graduation from the program. That's a way to operationalize a successful treatment. And then proximal response. This is a closer in time. And a proximal response in this case is whether or not they're providing positive drug urines screens, or whether or not they're complying with the judicial supervision, that is, with the drug court program. So that's the proximal response. The adaptation occurs according to tailoring variables. That's number 2 here on your slide. And tailoring variables in our case on the prior slide was whether involved the individual, their level of risk, and then how they were responding once they were in treatment. And our whole picture, that whole diagram, that tree diagram we saw, was a picture of decision rules. We also saw a variety of intervention options, different levels of court supervision, different types of drug abuse counseling. And lastly, we saw when the adaptation was triggered, it was monthly. Initially, when you came into the program, and then monthly thereafter. Those are the decision points. So what's a just-in-time adaptive intervention? Well, this is just an adaptive intervention. It's just here now interventions are potentially being provided at much closer intervals in time, hopefully just in time, and when needed, and also wherever they're needed. Here's an example by Katie Wickowitz. This is, I think, maybe in another couple of years it won't be considered a just in time, but in present stage it was just in time. And here's a case where these were college students. They were prompted 3 times a day for EMA, that is assessments. These were kids or college students who had a history of binge drinking and co-occurring with smoking. And you can see the list of types of assessments: smoking urge, self-regulation demands, and so on. And then the only time they delivered urge surfing interventions was if the participant reported an urge to smoke. So right there you see the tailoring variable is the urge to smoke. The decision rule is provide an urge surfing intervention if participant reports an urge to smoke. The decision times are the 3 times a day at which the assessments were collected. So this example doesn't involve any sensor-based assessments. So this example is another interesting example. It's one that I need, actually. It's to help us reduce our sedentary behavior. And here, sensors on the computer measure uninterrupted computer time via mousing activity and keyboard activity. And one gets a text message and then a link to an app on the smartphone if the person has 30 minutes of uninterrupted computer activity. Again, you see that tailoring variable. The tailoring variable here is the length of time of uninterrupted computer activity. The decision rule is you get a text message versus a suggestion about walking only if 30 minutes of uninterrupted computer activity occurs. So both adaptive interventions, they're both definitely time varying. All of our examples were time varying, and they're both adaptive. Of course, a big difference in just-in-time adaptive interventions, JITAI, is that technology plays a critical role. And the idea, of course, our goal is to be able to provide, to obtain the right kind of information when it is needed and where it's needed, and then to provide supportive interventions whenever and wherever they're needed. So if we go back to those components, those elements of an adaptive intervention, we have the exact same elements, just like before. The real difference is the in the moment nature. So here, the proximal response, let's think about that with Katie Wickowitz's trial. It was to help the person manage their urge to smoke. So it's a very proximal, the intervention has a very proximal goal to help that person overcome their current urges to smoke. And the decision points tend to be more real time. In the computer study, could almost be every 30 minutes that you're asked to try and increase your activity. I'm going to go through, you're seeing me start, and I'm going through each of these elements, these 5 elements of a just-in-time adaptive intervention. And I just want to talk about each one in turn. I think it's worthwhile to give some thought to this. And so what might be a distal outcome for if you're designing a just-in-time adaptive intervention? Of course, it's going to be some kind of clinical goal. Often it's the very type of outcome that might be related to your primary analysis in a clinical trial. So it might be substance use cessation or activity level, if you're interested in increasing activity, or if you're doing a study that's about improving adherence to medications, it might be adherence to meds. I was thinking right now Thrust 4 is really involved in designing the smoking study, and there a distal outcome might be the smoking rate or the time until which one relapses. The idea here with the just-in-time adaptive intervention is to target that distal outcome, and the way we target it is by formulating our intervention options to work on the proximal responses, to change those proximal responses, and thus improve the distal outcome. So proximal responses, this fits in really well with the way I think, it seems to me that the way we think about the problems, behavior change and maintenance of change in the behavioral sciences. In particular, proximal responses are akin to mediators. They're elements on the causal chain that move from our intervention to our targeted distal outcome. I give you 3 examples of mediators. Could be the short-term targeted behavior. So, for example, if you're trying to help people remain physically active, it could very well be the physical activity over the next 30 minutes. That would be a good mediator. Another type of proximal response might be short-term risk. So like in Katie's study, helping someone deal with their craving to smoke. Or another type of short-term risk might be a measure of stress, so helping someone manage their stress so that they can reduce their risk for smoking or eating and so on. And then the last type of proximal response, I think it's one that we're beginning to see a little bit of it in mobile health, but I don't know if we're really operationalizing it very clearly, and that's engagement in the intervention. I think actually this is going to be one that's going to be really important when we go to just-in-time adaptive interventions that are intended to last for longer periods of time, say like a year, for example. I wanted to give you some examples of intervention options, and I think I'm really speaking to the people who know a lot here, but I just want to go through this so that I'm being very complete. So there's an enormous variety of intervention options. Behavioral strategies, that is, for example, alternatives to if I feel a lot of craving, perhaps if I go for a walk, that'll help me manage my craving. So an alternative activity, or maybe trying to stay in settings which are supportive of my desired behavior. Cognitive strategies, here it might be if I've lapsed in smoking, it might help me reframe that lapse. Self-monitoring, of course, is a really big one, reflecting back to me how much I'm eating or how much I'm smoking and so on. Social linkages, I see this a lot in substance abuse studies. That is, there may be an intervention where there's an automated text message to a partner to please contact you because you're feeling a lot of craving, and so on. Other types of interventions are whether just to provide an intervention or whether to recommend that the individual access the interventions that are residing on the phone, or whether to recommend or prompt the person to self-monitor. So that's a yes-no type thing. Should we provide an intervention? Yes, no. And another one, the third bullet point here under intervention options is how to provide an intervention option. I actually, I hadn't really thought a lot about this, but I've had the privilege to work with guys in human-computer interaction, and how you provide the intervention on the lock screen, on the watch, how much work the person has to do to see material. This is all very important, and that could be an element of your intervention option. Lastly, probably the most useful intervention option is to not bother the person at all, the do nothing option. These of course, interventions tend to be theoretically, scientifically driven. There's a really nice paper by Klein et al. On this. I was thinking again of the Thrust 4's work on the smoking study, and there, one of the intervention option that's currently under consideration is whether or not to prompt the person to access one of 4 interventions, that is stress regulation applications, that are residing on the smartphone. So should I prompt you? Is it worthwhile to prompt you to access one of these 4 stress regulation applications? That might be one intervention option that we end up having in the Thrust 4 smoking cessation study. So tailoring variables, these are moderators. So again, this fits in perfectly with the way we think in the behavioral sciences. These are variables or information, sensor information, or could be self-report information that informs which intervention option is best, when, where, and for whom. Often they are the very proximal response. So like if I'm trying to decide whether or not to prompt you to access a stress reduction application, I might look at your current stress. If you're totally stressed out, it may not be useful. We don't know. So to prompt you, I may just produce more stress. So stress itself, current stress, may be useful in deciding whether or not to provide an intervention to reduce stress. And then, of course, there's risk and protective factors. For example, in an exercise a study aimed at increasing activity, how busy your calendar on your phone looks at the time of a suggestion. If your calendar is really busy, it may not be worthwhile to prompt you to provide a suggestion. It may just aggravate you. And lastly, I think we're going to see that in future that really important tailoring variables are going to be measures of burden and adherence. I was thinking again of the Thrust 4 smoking study, in which we're using auto sense to measure stress, and where the goal is to help people quit smoking. Some tailoring variables might be the current level of stress, low, moderate, or high, and another alternate tailoring variable may be the person's location, whether they're at home or work. One might think of other potential tailoring variables as well. Decision points. This is really a difficult issue. At least I find it difficult. They generally come in 2 flavors that I've seen. One is at regular intervals in time. For example, if you think of some of David Gustafson's studies in alcoholism with recovery support. There, they track where the individual is, and if the person gets within a certain number of meters of the liquor store where they usually buy liquor, they send an alert. In this case, the decision points might have to be pretty frequent in time, say every minute or so, because you want to catch that person before they actually enter the liquor store. So most of the time, the decision points will result in nothing happening at all because the person is not close to the liquor store. But when they do get within a certain number of meters of the liquor store, you'd want to be able to do something. The other kind of decision point I see this a lot in addictions is when the user requests help. So they're feeling a lot of craving and they press a button on the phone asking for some sort of support. That would be, so the type of support we provide might be a decision that needs to be made at that time. A big question, I really think this is difficult, is how frequent should the decision points be? And that's really guided by the dynamics of the tailoring variables. So in the case of David Gustafson's study with alcohol, recovery support for alcohol, you really have to have very frequent decision points because you don't want to accidentally wait till they get into the liquor store before you send the alert. You want to get them as they're heading towards the liquor store. I was thinking about the Thrust 4 smoking study. I'm not sure how other people might feel, but I was thinking, how often should the decision points be here? It really depends on how frequent, how variable we think stress will be. If it's highly variable, the decision points might have to be pretty frequently. There needs to be a good bit of discussion about this. Of course, most of these decision points will not result in any kind of intervention, but we want to catch people when they do need help. So we might have to have very frequent decision points. Decision rules. Decision rules, that's how this adaptation occurs in the just-in-time adaptive intervention. So they link patient information to the intervention options at the decision points. Usually a just-in-time adaptive intervention, or we call it a JITAI, the JITAI often includes many different decision rules. And we normally develop these decision rules using empirical evidence, that is data, theory, and clinical experience. And the rest of the talk today is going to be about how we might collect high-quality data that can help us develop effective decision rules so that we have a very effective just-in-time adaptive intervention. So this is a slide where we're going to have to go through the parts of a decision rule. So here you see this is Katie's study. No, it's not. It's actually a substance abuse study that I know of that went on in Chicago. So the decision point is when they collected self-report assessments. The tailoring variable, here there was a measure of risk, a composite measure of substance abuse risk. Of course, in the MD2K smoking Thrust 4 smoking study, we could imagine our measure of risk might be the stress level of the individual. Then you see those intervention options. There's two options here. A reminder to access one of the interventions that are residing on the phone. Those interventions are always there, but now we're just reminding the participant to access them, prompting them to access the interventions. Or the other intervention option is do nothing. That's the one we spoke about earlier. And then, of course, the proximal response here in this case was to the example I'm thinking of in substance abuse was to help the person manage their craving. In our MD2K smoking study, you could imagine, of course, that might be to help the person manage their stress, the proximal response of stress. Here's another decision rule real quick. This has to do with the sedentary behavior, too much time spent sitting at our computers. Here's at 5-minute intervals. 5-minute intervals. You look at the current computer activity. So the decision points are every 5 minutes. The current computer activities are tailoring variable. If it reaches a criterion, you might recommend movement. So I just wanted to summarize the elements of a just-in-time adaptive intervention, a JITAI. So we have our outcomes, the distal outcomes. Like I said before, I think this is usually akin to our primary outcome in a clinical trial. It's a clinical goal, like smoking cessation, for example, time. And then the proximal response. The proximal response is guided by our mediational theories. Then there's the intervention options. The intervention options, they're developed so as to get to affect those proximal responses and thus improve the distal outcome. The tailoring variables tell us who should get which intervention option in order to have the greatest impact on the proximal response. The decision points are when we're going to provide, we might potentially provide an intervention. And then lastly, the decision rules, which tie things all together. So what I want to do is I want to go through an example. This is not an MD2K example, but it's a micro-randomized trial that's going into the field either the next week, in the next 2 weeks or so. It's called HeartSteps, and it's about in reducing sedentary behaviors. And it'll help me make the ideas behind the micro-randomized trial more concrete. And what I'd like to, I'm going to keep trying to bring back, think about the thrust for smoking cessation study. And so I'd like to stop at different times, hear what people think. Be interesting to hear, which I'll say. Okay, so HeartSteps is, it's supposed to, the idea is to encourage and maintain physical activity. It involves a jawbone bracelet and an app on the phone. The jawbone bracelet measures step counts and sleep quality. The app on the phone is picking up all kinds of things. I'll talk about that shortly. So HeartSteps is a 42-day study. Our thrust for smoking cessation study, micro-randomized study, is going to be a 14-day study. So HeartSteps is a little longer. The proximal response in HeartSteps is going to be actually a proximal measure of our distal outcome, which is activity. So in this case, it's the step count over the next hour. In HeartSteps, there's 2 intervention options. And in both cases, it's whether or not we're looking at whether or not to provide an intervention. I'll discuss these in greater detail. But the first is a momentary lock screen activity recommendation. This is a little contextualized recommendation that gives you an idea about how you might be active or a little less sedentary in the moment at this time. And then in the evening, daily activity planning. That's the other type of intervention, which is planning for your entire next day. We're going to focus on number 1, and I'll tell you about the decision times. So in the case of the lock screen message, this is approximately every 2 to 2.5 hours. And you might ask, well, how did you decide 2 to 2.5 hours? Because remember, we're supposed to think of the dynamics of behavior in order to come up with our decision times, right? Well, what we did was the team that's involved with HeartSteps had access to a lot of jawbone data on their users, and they in looking at that data, they found that if individuals were active, they tended to be active around 5 different times of the day. These are people who are working. So it was pre-morning commute, around midday, mid-afternoon, around the evening commute time, and then after dinner. And that ends up being approximately every 2 to 2.5 hours. So that's why those decision times got selected. In terms of the daily, that is planning for the next day's activity, that was each evening the user specifies a time and then that's the time at which they plan, potentially might plan for the next day. There's a lot of tailoring variables being collected in this particular application. Activity recognition, we're using Google activity recognition. I think in the case of thrust force smoking cessation, Santosh's group is going to get us a much better activity recognition in terms of detecting whether someone's driving or not. But in this study, we're using the Google app for that. We're also collecting weather of the location and the location that you're at. We're collecting your how busy your calendar is over the next couple of hours, and a lot of other information. Actually, in this study, most of the data is collected via sensors on the phone and the bracelet, but there is every evening some self-assessments about the burden, the usefulness of the intervention, and so on. So we're going to focus here on the momentary lock screen recommendation. I wanted to show you a screenshot of it. I think it's quite interesting. So as I said, there's two options. We're either going to not bother you, that's no message, or there's going to be, what happens is your phone lights up and it pings, and then there's this message. And you can see this is a message that occurred March 14th. It was a pretty cold day, 11 degrees, and it was on a Saturday in the afternoon. So you can see the kind of message you might get. This is a message that might be appropriate on the weekend, in the afternoon, on a cold day. And these messages are contextualized like this. If you get a message, it is contextualized. The thing I want you to notice, which I think is quite interesting, Santosh would be interesting if we could do something similar to this in some of our studies, is first you see the little thumbs down. So the way you can get rid of this lock screen message is you can press thumbs down. See that little thumbs down on the far right? You press thumbs down, the message goes away, and you just indicated you don't like it. You can also press thumbs up. That means you like the message. And lastly, you can point to that little bell button in the middle. Yeah, that's the snooze button. And if you point to that, what happens is a drop-down menu comes up, and you can snooze the whole intervention for 4, 8, or 12 hours. So, for example, if you're going to a big meeting, you might snooze it so it doesn't aggravate you. So now I'm ready. I've described HeartSteps, and as I had said earlier, we're about to go into the field with a micro-randomized trial. And I also mentioned Thrust 4 right now is planning a micro-randomized trial in the smoking setting. And I'll mention some of the potential ideas as we go through this next couple of slides with the smoking cessation, even though I'm going to stick with HeartSteps primarily. Okay, so what is a micro-randomized trial? These are trials where at each decision time, you randomize between intervention options. So if you have a lot of decision times, you get a lot of randomizations. In HeartSteps, if we focus on the momentary lock screen message, they're every 2 to 2.5 hours. That's about 5 times. That's 5 times a day. It's a 42-day study. So that means each individual could be randomized 210 times. What's the elements of a micro-randomized trial? In some sense, it has a very parallel structure to a just-in-time adaptive intervention. That makes perfect sense because the purpose of these trials is to collect good data to help us design a just-in-time adaptive intervention. So one element is we're going to record the important outcomes. We're going to record, of course, the distal outcome if the trial is long enough. We're going to record potential proximal responses. We're going to record tailoring variables that we think might be useful in tailoring. We're not going to use them necessarily to tailor in this study, but we're going to record them so in data analyses we can look to see if they are useful. We're going to Now, in a micro-randomized trial, at the decision points, we randomize among intervention options. And then at the end of the trial, we use the resulting data we're going to actually talk about, we'll use the resulting data to test different hypotheses and also to help us form decision rules. So a lot of people ask, why in the world should I have to go to the hassle of a micro-randomized trial? And in particular, like there's been a number of studies where we say we have 4 different types of interventions. We just put them on the phone and we let the user, that is the participant, access those interventions whenever that person feels the need. And we can collect data on the timestamps of when they access the intervention. We can collect information on the person's situation at the time they access the intervention or prior to accessing the intervention. So you can imagine a study in which we just follow people in life and we see whenever they access the intervention, we record responses after they've accessed the intervention. We record tons of variables that we think might be important for tailoring at the time they're accessing the intervention. You might think, well, let's just use that kind of data. It'll be so much easier. We don't have to do this micro-randomization. The problem is with that data is we call it observational data, and it's very hard for us to disentangle why someone accessed the intervention from how they responded to the intervention. So they may access the intervention because they're more motivated as compared to someone who does not access the intervention. And they may have nice proximal responses precisely because they're more motivated, not because they accessed the intervention. So randomization eliminates this issue. And we know this if you work in clinical trials. It's the gold standard for helping us assess causal effects. And it's going to really help us build database decision rules because we'll know that the effect we see of a treatment is due to that treatment and not due to the reason why the person accessed that intervention. Okay, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the momentary lock screen recommendation. And we already mentioned there was 210 decision times, 5 times a day, 42 days. And each time you know I'm a statistician, so I wanted these randomizations to be 1/2 because that's how you have the highest power. But we have to, in these trials, we really have to consider the issue of burden, overburdening the participant. And our team, we got together and we thought, well, on average, how many times per day do we want to provide an intervention? And we realized, well, on average, about 2 times. We don't want to have a lot of days where you're provided an intervention 5 times a day. It's just too much. So if we want to provide an intervention around 2 times a day, then using a randomization probability of 2/5 gives us that. And that's the reason why these randomization probabilities are not equal. We really have to work all of this out, I think, and with the smoking cessation study, because we haven't figured out when our decision times will be, how frequent they'll be. So it's going to be a really interesting thing to do. So how do we design this trial? Well, we have to have some primary analysis, because that's the primary analysis is what's going to tell us how many people to recruit into our study. And usually this primary analysis is just addresses the question, do we even have a signal? Is there a signal there? Is there any evidence of an effect? And so that's exactly what you see me doing here on this slide. It says, I ask, does the intervention in our case, there's only one time varying intervention. Does it have an effect on the proximal response? And so what we're going to do is we're going to test the proximal main effect of the intervention components. in our case, we're going to be interested in the proximal main effect of the lock screen message. That's our example here. If you're someone who, if you've had statistics, for example, if you have a psychology background, a behavioral science background, you've probably had analysis of variance, and that's exactly, and in analysis of variance, we test for main effects. We also, in secondary analyses, look for interactions. Here we'll look for delayed effects as well of interventions, but our first analysis will be of the main effects, because this is much like an analysis of variance setup. So we have to really think about this, and this is, I think, a really important issue that we have to confront, and that's the fact that we know that because we can provide interventions in that person's life at any time, there's an enormous potential for habituation. That is, that they start to just ignore the messages we deliver, and our burden, that we begin to aggravate them. So as a result, we're suggesting that we allow the proximal main effects to vary with time. So just as the intervention, whether or not to provide a recommendation, varies over the 42-day study, we're going to allow the main effect to vary over the 42-day study. And that's to allow the fact that we may have burden. So to summarize, we're going to figure out how many people we need to recruit to detect a time-varying proximal main effect of the lock screen recommendation on activity. That's in the context of HeartSteps. That's what we do. I just want to remind everybody that, of course, we're incredibly interested in whether or not there's delayed effects. Like, I get a message now, I can't act on it at this time, but maybe I become more active later because I use my message later, or delayed effects of burden and so on. But the primary, the way we'll size the study is to see if there's any signal at all of the lock screen recommendation on activity. Okay, I think we need to, I'm going to stop right now just for a second. This slide is really important, and it took me a long time to deal with this issue. And I just want to ask if anybody has any questions.
Can you hear me,
Susan?
You have
to turn on your mute.
I think I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So I'm wondering about the fraction and how you figure that out, because I understand the 50-50 balance being ideal.
Right.
But in practical terms, I feel like we're shooting in the dark in thrust 4, trying to figure out what the right fraction is and what the cut points are, quite frankly. So what are your thoughts on how we're going to approach that?
Yeah, what we'll end up doing, what we're thinking right now, I mean, this is all really subject to thrust 4 discussion, right? But so we're thinking that we'll have some idea about, on average, how much time people spend in low stress, moderate stress, and high stress as they're trying to quit smoking. Then we'll have some idea of how often, how many times we'd want to intervene when they have high stress, how many times we might want to intervene when they have moderate, how many times we might want to intervene when they have low. We'll have that. We'll think about that. We'll think about how many times do we want to intervene per day, and then we'll back out of that probabilities for whether or not we provide an intervention when they're at low stress, moderate stress, or high stress. We also don't want to provide interventions too frequently, so we might say, for example, if you've had an intervention within the last 2 hours, we won't provide an intervention. That makes a lot of sense here, because we don't want to bother these people too much. So there'll be a number of considerations of that type, but I think we can do it. We just have to go through all of that. David's question, was a great question, David. I really appreciate it, because it actually gets into this whole slide that we're looking at now. When I first started working in this area, I was hoping I wouldn't have to deal with this issue. Now, this issue of availability, it's a little different from some of the availability issues that Santosh has looked at in the past. So I don't want these two kinds of uses of the word to get mushed together. So I'm going to try and be really clear about what this one means. So interventions, so I'm on this slide that we have in front of us right now. Interventions can only be delivered at a decision time if a person is available. So let's go back to HeartSteps. And we saw with the lock screen message that the person could snooze it for 4, 8, or 12 hours. So in that case, the person wouldn't be available, right? Another time the intervention wouldn't be available is if the participant is thought to be driving. We don't want to ping the person if we think they might be driving. We don't want to distract them. Also, another time we might not want to bother a participant in HeartSteps is if they're currently active. So if they're currently active, we don't want to ping them with a lock screen message suggesting that they're active. They should be active. That doesn't make scientific sense. So let's go to the, I'm keying off of David's question. Let's think of the MD2 smoking study that we're planning. So one way to think about availability is the following. For example, if we think they're driving, we should not ping them to suggest they access a stress reduction message app on the phone. That makes good sense. So we'll say they're not available if we think they're currently driving. We also might say that they're not available if they received a message in the past 2 hours. And that's because we don't want to constantly be bothering people. It doesn't make sense to send them messages one after another. Another time that a person might not be available is if they're not currently wearing AutoSense, the wearable device that detects stress level. If they're not currently wearing it, we don't know what their stress is. Essentially, they're signaling to us that they're unavailable for a stress management intervention. So our thrust for smoking cessation study has a lot of the similar elements to the HeartSteps study. So what do we mean when we talk about the main effect when we have this issue of availability? So this is that second bullet point on that slide there. I'm just going to read it out. The proximal main effect of treatment at a decision time is a difference between two groups of people. All of them are available. 40% were assigned a lock screen message. 60% were not assigned a lock screen message. So it's the difference between having a lock screen message versus not among available individuals. In fact, I'm not interested in the effect of a lock screen activity message among people who are currently driving their car. I may not be interested in the effect of a lock screen message among people who are currently already walking, and so on. This is
playing on that idea. I'm wondering if stress might be confounded with availability. So if somebody's experiencing high stress or showing signs of high stress, there may be other things that they're dealing with that are more pressing. So we may want to change the fraction so people are more likely to get the intervention then, because we know they're going to respond less frequently because of some of the competing demands for their attention. Whereas at low levels of stress, there's not as much competition for attention, so they might respond more frequently. So we could lower the fraction and end up with about the same amount of data across cells. Is that possible? And does that create some?
One could do that. One could do that. And another cool thing would be to analyze the data after the fact and see whether or not, I could very well see that, imagine that if someone's currently experiencing high stress, they may not respond to our message. So that would be very interesting. It may be that only when they have moderate stress that they might be responsive. So current stress may also be a moderator of treatment effectiveness. So this is another slide where things get really subtle. If you've kind of gone to sleep, and you want to catch up, now's the time to wake up. I have a lot to talk to you about on this slide. We already said we want to allow that the proximal main effect to be time varying. Now let's think about why it might be time varying. I gave you a little schematic on this slide. In the case of HeartSteps, remember there's 210 decision points in HeartSteps because it's a 42-day study. And the y-axis would be the effect. This is a standardized effect of the activity suggestion on, say, a walking. Now, how might we expect the effect of the lock screen message on your activity to change with time? Well, when you first enter the study, you're discombobulated, you don't know how to take advantage, you haven't really incorporated these messages in your life, so you might not get much of an effect. So that's why you see a low or no effect initially at the beginning of the study on the far left-hand side of this graph. But then as time goes on, we thought, well, there you'll start to become engaged, you'll act on messages that are sent to you and become more active, so we might see an increase in activity. Then, unfortunately, as time goes on, we're concerned that you're going to habituate to the messages. You're not even going to, they'll appear on your lock screen, you'll see them, but they're not going to really make much of an impact on you. So you might actually see a decrease in effectiveness with time. That's why we have this like curvilinear quadratic shape. Now there's another reason why we might see the main effect of the lock screen message on your activity change with time. And that's because at each of these decision time points, we have a different group of people who are available. Let's think about that. At the beginning of time, pretty much everybody's available unless they're driving, but pretty much everybody. As time goes on, you'll have some group of people who've bought the Kool-Aid, right? They'll be active. So they may be active at each of those 5 times, who knows? So they're not going to be available anymore. You'll have another group of people who are so aggravated with you, it's unreal, and they'll have turned off the intervention. They're not going to be available. So the effect may vary through time because the people among whom you're assessing that effect may vary. So there's 2 reasons why we may see the proximal main effect vary with time. It may be at the individual level, it varies with time because first you have to learn how to utilize the lock screen message, and then later on you may habituate, so it may reduce in effectiveness. The other reason why you might see the main effect vary with time is because the kinds of people that are available may vary with time. In fact, if most of the people who drop out, who are no longer available as the study progresses, are the ones who are very active, so thus they're walking at each of those 5 time points, or they're active in some way, then we're just looking at the effect among the people who are more resistant in some sense. So you might see a decreased effect among that group of people. It's very interesting. Of course, when we design the study, our goal is just to see, do we have an effect at all? We want to know if we have a signal. So what we're going to do is we're going to determine the number of participants for our study so that we can test at each of these 210 times, in HeartSteps it was 210, whether or not we have an effect among each of these 210 times. And a simple way to think about this is to say, well, I'll detect an effect. In the case of an activity study, you might think, well, I'll look for effects that have a quadratic shape, as I showed you on that last slide. So this effect, this main effect, may have an intercept term which I denoted by a beta sub 0, a linear term, which I denoted by a beta sub 1, and a quadratic term, which I denoted by beta sub 2. One could use other shapes as well, but for the activity study, this seemed to work out. Our team feels this is pretty good. And what we'll do is, instead of individually testing whether or not we have an effect at each of the 210 times, we'll parameterize that effect over time by this quadratic, and we'll test if the intercept, the linear, and the quadratic term are all 0. So here's another, at least I found this slide really nuanced. I think the behavioral scientists in this group will be less surprised at this because they're used to N of 1 trials. But as a statistician, at first, I didn't anticipate this, and now it's pretty clear to me this had to be the case. Okay, so I'm going to go through it. Because we are forming a test to detect a proximal main effect, which is quadratic, what we end up doing is we end up using not only between person responses, lock screen versus no lock screen message, we also contrast with in-person responses, lock screen versus no lock screen message. And that gains us enormous amount of power, and so we can use smaller samples. And I want to just go through this a little bit more carefully because some of you may be like me, and it took me a while to get this straight in my head. So let's just think about the first point in time. We know that 40% of people will get a lock screen message, 60% will not. If we just size the study to detect the effect of the message at that first point in time, it's like a 2-arm study, 40% are in one arm, 60% in the other. That's a 2-arm study in which we're only using between person responses in order to decide whether or not a lock screen message is worthwhile or not, increases activity. That's one extreme. Another extreme is that I tell you that the effect of a lock screen message is the same regardless of how long the study goes on. So each person, a particular person experiences the exact same increase in activity when they get the message over not getting the message. Then you would tell me, oh, I just need one person and I just need to see them repeatedly, sometimes without, sometimes with the message. What we're doing here is we're choosing an in-between path between these two extremes. So we're both taking advantage of between-person contrast as well as within-person contrast. And it's that desire to focus on a quadratic alternative to the null hypothesis that allows us to do this. It's going to give us smaller sample size, and you're going to see this on the next slide. And I feel comfortable doing this because I don't think the effect of the intervention is going to change drastically from day to day, and I don't think the set of available people will change drastically from day to day. So I feel that there's going to be a smoothness. This quadratic alternative to the null hypothesis is appropriate. So what we're going to use is a test based on something called, it's a regression type test. It's based on a very popular statistical method that's been used to size many, many clinical trials. It's called GEE. We're not doing GEE. We're just able to use the software for GEE to construct this test statistic. And if you've ever sized a trial, you know as well as I that you need to specify clinically or scientifically important effects. And we're going to do this in the case of HeartSteps on the next slides. We're going to specify standardized effects, which is usually the case. That is the signal, the coefficient divided by the standard deviation. We'll specify what we think the proximal effect will be on the very first day of the study. Then we might specify the average effect we might expect to get over the entire trial duration. And then, because I'm worried about habituation, the day that we might expect to see a maximal proximal effect. So here in HeartSteps, we decided to be really conservative and state that the first day, we don't think we'll see anything. This is just a conservative approach. I think it's a good idea to do that in general, if you go for this quadratic alternative. I'll give you on the next slide, don't go to the next slide, but on the next one, I'll show you a whole bunch of different average standardized proximal effects. That's the reason why there's a question mark in that second box. And then we decided about, it's a 42-day study. HeartSteps is a 42-day study, so we decided maybe around a little over halfway through the study, we might see a decrease in the effectiveness of our messages. So we said 28 days. So here's the effect sizes. We're looking for a power of 80%. Type 1 error rate is 0.05. This particular table allows for either 70% availability or 50% availability. That means 50% of the decision times you're available or 70% of the decision times you're available. And then you look at those standardized effect sizes, average effect sizes over the 42 days. Now, I think people who are behavioral scientists will resonate with me. This is the slide I saw. I saw a slide or a table sort of like this. And that's the first time I realized this issue of how we're able to use with in-person contrast, because these are incredibly small standardized effect sizes. If you go to Cohen's standardized effect sizes, a small standardized effect size is 0.2 standard deviations. And these are much smaller standard deviations. And you see the sample sizes are really quite small. There's two things I think we have to remember when we look at this slide. At this time, in our world, in the mobile health world, we don't really have a good understanding of what a reasonable standardized proximal effect size might be. It may be that the reasonable values are very different from Cohen's standardized effect sizes. And in fact, it may be that 0.08 is a very large effect size in this world. We just don't know. We'll have a lot more information because we'll have had a number of micro-randomized studies as we go forward. But at this time, we don't know if these are large or small. They appear very small, these standardized effect sizes, but in this setting, they may be large. So here's a power curve. As you can imagine, the sample size calculator that we developed, we have run many, many simulations to see whether or not, to evaluate the quality of the sample size calculator, to see if we really achieve 80% power when that's our goal. And I'm going to go through on the next couple of slides when you have to be careful. This is for 70. This particular power curve is for 70% availability. Okay, so I just want to point out you can micro-randomize other components. So in the case of HeartSteps, we had the evening daily planning for our daily activity on the following day. We're randomizing that. So we have two time-varying components, daily activity planning and the momentary lock screen messages. When you plan these trials, and this recommendation comes straight out of our simulations of the sample size calculator, and this makes perfect sense to people who've sized clinical trials, is first of all, you want to underestimate the amount of time participants are available. So for example, if you tell me that you think in your study around 70% of the decision times people will be available for an intervention, but it turns out that they're only available 50% of the time, then you're going to have way too small a number sample size. And that's because availability is really related to sample size. Now, the other thing we have to be conservative about is the average proximal effect. So if you state, or our team states that we think our average proximal effect will be 0.1, and we size the study to detect an average standardized proximal effect of 0.1, and it turns out that it's only 0.05, then we're going to not have as much power as we had hoped. So these are standard kinds of concerns that we have to be we have to think about when we plan trials. We want to be conservative as much as we can be, subject to cost constraints and so on. It turns out in our simulations, and this is number 3 I'm looking at, that the power to detect the main effect is robust to interactions and to delayed effects. And this is if one has done a lot of work in factorial designs and fractional factorial designs, this is well known. And so we expected it to be the case, and it was, in fact, here. Also, I just want to point out, we all know that often the primary analysis in any clinical trial, it's the one you place your bets on, it's how you size the study, it's the guarantee you give to the funder. But it's the secondary analyses that tend to be really exciting from a scientific point of view. And that's the case here too. Secondary analyses can concern time-varying effect moderation. So David and I were talking earlier about the stress, and I conjectured that if someone is at very high stress, it may be that the intervention, a stress-reducing intervention, is less useful than if someone is at moderate stress, and so on. So you can also use the data to help you construct data-driven decision rules also. The last slide is the people who collaborated in HeartSteps, and this slide actually is reminiscent of the MD2K team, because it involves people from a whole variety of disciplinary boundaries areas. So Peng is a grad student. He did a lot of the work. He's in statistics. Andy Lee and Cyrus Anderson, they're app programmers. Andy has a little startup company that they do programming for these kind of apps. Pedja Klasa is a human-computer interaction scientist. Ambuj is a computer scientist, like many of the people on our MD2K team. And Billy Nahum Shani is a behavioral scientist, again, like many of the people on our MD2K team. So I think we're ready for questions, if there's any more questions.
I'm here. And you
have
want to pick on me?
Because your name starts with C.
Oh, I see. So I'm the first one you see. Well, I'm very intrigued by the treatment response curve that you show, and I was thinking about the thrust for, because if we do see a quadratic relationship, kind of an inverted U, doesn't it make sense that we have multiple treatment, that we stagger them in terms of delivery, so that we will always, it's almost always like when one is dipping in the effectiveness, another treatment will be taking the place of that, because that one it will be in the arm of the ascending arm in terms of effectiveness. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, it does. Actually, in HeartSteps, we're funded to run 2 more studies after this. And if we see a drop off, due to habituation, which we expect we're going to see, we're thinking that we're going to allow, what we'll do is, this actually, HeartSteps was funded to provide a mobile intervention for people who had a heart attack. And now we're trying to help them stay active. And so after you've had a heart attack, you also want to change your diet. You want to keep your diet healthy. You want to have a healthy diet, and you want to keep your stress low. So what we thought was this would be totally cool, like someone like you, we would track how engaged they are. And if it seems like they're dropping off in engagement or they're habituating, we might then contact them, like via email, or text messaging, and ask them they'd like to change the focus. So they might change their focus from activity, say, to healthy eating, or from activity to stress reduction, and with the hope that we can maintain. So that means we'd be changing their proximal response, of course, because you're changing the behavior goal. But at the same time, we would maintain engagement over a longer period. And that feeds into the comment you made.
Exactly, because like as one is dropping off, you want another one that can capture the attention, so that we will still be in an optimal range of treatment efficacy. So,
right. Right. And I don't think we're going to see a quadratic. That's too simplistic, but we're just using that to size the study. That's usually the way you size these studies, is you have a very simplistic, robust approach. And then when you actually analyze the data, you have a more complex curve. You permit more complex curves.
Yeah. Yes, I understand. But I think it makes perfect sense that efficacy of response will drop off. So yeah, your point is I think it's right on the mark, that after a while, like people will just say, well, it's the lock screen again. Come on. Like, Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Susan, I just wanted to thank you very much for doing this today. And if anyone wants to be on the mailing list for future webinars, please email info@md2k.org and we will get you signed up.
Great.